According to tradition, few miracles happened in the old days. Holy Fire ceremony signifies the resurrection of Christ. The Holy Fire that comes from heaven lights all candles. We all believe in miracles. We believe it could happen, but it doesn't exactly work that way. Each pilgrim comes with the mind that miracles happen and Christ is risen, and it excites people. And here's the, if you get excited, whether I want or not, I get excited too. Religious excitement. It could happen, yes. At the beginning, the Ethiopian church, they had big role in the Holy Fire celebration. They're the one who entered inside the tomb and took the light out, and the Armenians, Greeks and others
Отсюда много вопросов.
took the fire from them.
Первый вопрос, откуда столько времени у тебя, чтобы заниматься тем, чего не существует, или как сказать, или, какой-то, да, откуда у тебя столько, да, то есть, получается так, это не суть разговора, я имею в виду, что, получается, что жизнь твоя настолько никчемная, что тебе даже, не только что даже у тебя есть на это время, а что тебе, да, что у тебя есть на это время, что тебе больше его некуда девать, кроме как заниматься процедурами, которые не существуют. Что, никчемная жизнь твоя, понимаешь? Поэтому вот, да, то есть и ты это осознаешь изнутри. И тогда отсюда можно, с этим уже можно работать тогда. А как можно жить более кчемную жизнь тогда как-то? Наверное, так просто. Давай думать как-то будем. Да что-то думать-то. Да ладно, не то что думать, это и так, в принципе, понятно. То есть как бы, и в конце концов выяснится что-нибудь типа того, что у тебя вообще на это, что ты не имеешь права этим всем заниматься. Потому что у тебя есть жизнь, и ты обязан ее прожить. Например, можешь в любые слова это облечь, как бы все равно это только так, то есть как бы другого быть не может просто, не то что не может. То есть, как вот сказать, короче, это все, да, это все зло, как минимум. Это не важно. Хорошо, видишь, это уже все. То есть этим заниматься нельзя, короче. Это не то, что... Почему сложно? Это, как бы, ничем не хуже, чем другой там способ убить время, убить свою жизнь. Да. Что ты не имеешь права, по сути. То есть, то есть, не то, что не имеешь права, просто если ты можешь жизнь, а ты можешь ее прожить, потому что ты живой, Вот ты прямо сейчас можешь начать другое решение принимать и что-то по-другому делать, и менять, и меняться там, или еще что-нибудь, да? То есть, да, чего ты не собираешь, да, ну, например, да, он это имеет в виду. То есть ЧТД, даже говорить не о чем, кажется.
And it has to be nourished, fed.
Ну,
So that's what church or religion does to a person.
Наверное. Да, вообще просто бред, как это самое, вообще просто.
I love this place. Despite all the problems that we have with other churches, disagreements or whatever, it's a nice place to be there. When it comes at night, sometimes nobody's here, and you start thinking, my God, you know, is this place real? I'm here now. You start with, you know, questioning yourself. I mean, how happened that I'm here now, you know?
Бог существует, если он существует, ну и как, нет, неважно, как ты это назовешь. Сила жизни, созидания, то есть то, что да, то есть, да нет никакого Бога, короче, потому что это специально придуманная такая, да. То есть, и вот это, да, ну, то есть это в каждом из нас. Понял тебя, покуда ты жив. И даже, в принципе, мертв тоже в какой-то степени остается это. Да, ну, то есть тело-то остается же. Ну, это как бы некое искусственное такое разделение, скажем. Да. Ну, то есть жизнь, то есть тело, да, то есть некое механизм изнутри, который существует, как бы, да, как, да, понял тебя. Да. Ну, это вот он имел в виду, да.
There's a difference in explaining the nature of Christ, not the physical nature, but the union of God and man.
Ну, так это, ну вот, только это просто, ну, наоборот, значит, наоборот.
But the Catholics and the Greeks believe that those two natures, although united, but they function separately. From that point of view, in the middle of the 5th century, the churches were separated because of different thinking. Even wars happened for that. Judgment of people from outside the church is not the same as the judgment we use. It may not sound logical what we do or what we say.
То есть Бога нет, надо относиться к своей жизни по-человечески.
But over here, inside the church, according to the
Потому что Бог
statute,
это зло.
it is accepted.
Бог это ложь. То есть и это ложь, которую ты никогда не выполнишь.
That's the way we are used to it. And that's probably the way we will keep doing it.
Чем больше зла в мире, тем Бог сильнее, тем больше Бога в людях Бога. Нет, потому что не было. Если бы Бог был, все бы просто рождались и все бы просто... Да, то есть никому бы не надо было даже про это говорить. А вот психологические проблемы есть. То есть, просто неадекватное отношение. Много чего есть, а вот Бога нет. Но все намного проще. То есть...
Volunteers continue to prepare for the worst.
Всё, ну да.
Focus on Europe.
Вот,
In 30
да.
minutes on DW. Is the end of the pandemic in sight? We show what it could look like. A return to a new normal. And we visit those who are finding it difficult. Experiences, successes, and news. In our weekly COVID-19 special.
Есть жизнь, понимаешь, жизнь в людях. И не только в людях. К которой надо к своей жизни относиться уважительно, потому что ты, да, ну, наверное, но только ты только ей, ты потому что только своей жизнью живешь, только своим телом. Жизнь, которая спаяна с твоим телом, что ли, как написано. Спаяна у него, не знаю, которая живая, ну просто жизнь, блин, да, это как бы, ну просто вот реально скажешь, что жизнь твоя, да. И что ты будешь в течение жизни, смотри, ты не можешь ничего не делать, то есть, да. Тебе как-то надо взаимодействовать будет, ну, понял, что делаешь. Да, ну это он видит, да. Пожрать, посрать, ну, так не, люди так пробовали жить, ну, наверное, меня не касается это. Мне на вас, значит, вообще насрать.
This is DW News and these are top stories.
Russia has confirmed that the top warship in its Black Sea fleet, the Moskva, has sunk while being towed back to port in stormy weather. Earlier, the Kremlin acknowledged that the ship had caught fire following an explosion. Ukraine says the blaze was caused by its missiles, which struck the vessel off the port of Odessa. A U.S. federal court has convicted a former member of the so-called Islamic State for his role in a hostage-taking plot. El-Shafi El-Sheikh, a former British national, was charged with abduction, torture, and the beheading of several IS hostages in Syria, including journalists and aid workers. He's the highest-profile IS fighter to stand trial in the U.S. Israeli security forces have killed 3 Palestinians during fresh raids into the West Bank district of Jenin. Israel launched a crackdown on militants following a wave of deadly attacks on its citizens. 14 Israelis have been killed in the past 3 weeks. This is DW News from Berlin. You can get more news on our website at dw.com.
Ukraine claims that one of its missiles hit a Russian warship in the Black Sea. That ship has now sunk. But on land, Russian forces are on the brink of capturing the city of Mariupol, and that would be the first major loss for Ukraine. It has been 50 days since the Russian invasion began. The losses on both sides are getting worse, sending shockwaves across the globe. Tonight, no sign of peace in Ukraine, plenty of signs that the war is making the world uglier, poorer, and the people in it hungrier. I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. This is The Day.
If I say I'm in pain, it's only like 1% of what I'm feeling.
Dear friends, above all, this war must end.
I've been living in Bucha all my life, and I would always invite my friends to come here.
The people of Ukraine cannot bear the violence being inflicted on them.
I'm optimist, so I'm sure we'll build the city.
And the most vulnerable people around the world cannot become collateral damage in yet another disaster for which they bear no responsibility.
And we'll make it even more beautiful than before.
Also coming up, Elon Musk wants to buy Twitter and rescue free speech in the process. Musk is the richest person on the planet, but a radical Twitter tweak will require more than just money.
If the board says no, as a fiduciary, they'll be eating lawsuits for breakfast. But I think for the Twitter board and for the executives, this becomes a worse nightmare.
To our viewers watching on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. We begin the day with a pledge of support from one president to another. U.S. President Joe Biden has approved an additional $800 million worth of military assistance to Ukraine. The package includes heavy artillery and helicopters, exactly what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says his forces need to repel a new Russian offensive expected any day now in the east of the country. Eastern Ukraine is where the Kremlin is aiming its military might. Russian forces took heavy losses when they attempted to take the Ukrainian capital Kyiv. Forced to pull back, Vladimir Putin's soldiers are focusing now on the Donbass region. Russian-backed separatists have controlled parts of the Donbass since 2014 and may now try to seize the rest of the region. The Klitschko brothers have become part of the voice and face of the Ukrainian resistance for much of the world. Vitaly Klitschko is the mayor of Kyiv. His brother, Vladimir, is a former heavyweight boxer, now turned soldier. In this exclusive interview, Vladimir Klitschko doesn't pull any punches regarding the threat to Ukraine and the Russian siege of Mariupol.
In the next coming days, obviously, will be major battles in the east and the south of the country, and we really look to defend southeast of the country, as well as preparing for possible coming back and aiming the capital. We are prepared for anything, for worst cases, for chemical weapons attack. We prepared for everything. The city, as a matter of fact, the city is still defended, and defenders of the city are still in Mariupol. The situation is very critical, very critical. For the past 2 weeks, the city has been endlessly bombarded. I don't know how many thousands of civilians have been killed and how many are still in the city. It's very difficult to get exact numbers due to situation, understandably. But the city is still fighting back. I'm proud of our country, women and men, for standing together against this senseless war and Russian aggression, especially in the city of Mariupol. President Steinmeier made huge mistakes in helping Russia with what Russia became today. He acknowledged his mistakes, he confirmed it, and made his open statements against aggression of Russia, war with Russia, and President Putin in particular. And I believe and I hope that this meeting with President Steinmeier, German President, and Ukraine President Zelensky are going to take place in the next coming days or weeks here in Kyiv.
And you can watch the rest of our exclusive interview with Vladimir Klitschko on our YouTube channel. The address is right there. You see it on your screens. A stunning blow tonight to Russia's Navy. Its main warship, the Moskva, has sunk in the Black Sea. It was being towed back to port in stormy weather. Just hours earlier, Ukraine says that its missiles hit the ship, possibly igniting a fire on board.
As it turned out, this new Ukrainian postage stamp was prophetic, shown off just hours before the incident by President Volodymyr Zelensky with the message, the Russian warship always has only one direction. Russia blames a fire for damage. Ukraine, though, has a slightly different take. In the Black Sea region, the Moskva warship was hit by Neptune anti-ship missiles. It sustained substantial damage. A fire started. Other ships tried to provide assistance, but a storm and the powerful explosion of ammunition turned the ship over and it started sinking. The Moskva came to prominence at the start of the war, being told to go F itself when it tried to capture Ukraine's Snake Island in the Black Sea. captive before being freed in a prisoner exchange. The Moskva was the main ship in Russia's Black Sea fleet, armed with 16 cruise missiles, as well as a long-range air defense system. If Ukraine's claim is true, that defense system appears to have failed catastrophically.
What does Elon Musk want to do with Twitter? A couple of weeks ago, he became the company's largest shareholder. Now he wants all the shares. Musk has made an offer to buy Twitter, setting the value of the social media company at $43 billion. In a letter to Twitter's board, Musk wrote that he invested in the company because he believes in its potential to be a platform for free speech around the globe. But the billionaire says that he now realizes Twitter will only be able to thrive as a private company. Would Elon Musk, as the sole owner of Twitter, be a good thing for the company? Would it mean anything for furthering free speech around the globe? To talk about that, let's pull in Matt Stoller. He's Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project. He's also author of the book Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and on the program. Elon Musk as the sole owner of Twitter, would that be a problem?
I think Twitter itself right now is a problem, and all social media is a problem. So, you know, the ownership structure is less important than the way that we've regulated these firms and allowed them to basically help undermine the fabric of society wherever they're operative.
Well, I want to get into that in just a moment, but let me ask you, in your opinion, should Elon Musk or any person for that matter be allowed to own a social media platform?
Well, right now Mark Zuckerberg owns Facebook, so I don't see that much of a difference. But the problem is that you shouldn't have private total control over the public commons. What we need are clear public rules about what is allowed and what is not, and these rules should apply to everybody because clearly these are public institutions. You know, they're for profit. There's property involved, but you know, like any common carrier, like any telecom network, the public has an interest in how these platforms actually operate.
And the problem here, if I'm reading you correctly, is that these platforms, these social media platforms, they're not responsible for the content that's on their platforms, and that's at the heart of the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, these firms are communication networks, but they finance themselves with advertising. So you might be trying to communicate, but the platform itself has an interest in structuring the speech to get you to keep using, to addict you so that they can keep selling you ads. That's not how most communication platforms work. You know, with your telecom company, they might overcharge you, but they don't care who you talk to, they don't care what you say, and they're not trying to get you to talk to certain people or give you propaganda in one way or another. And that's because the business model is not based on a conflict of interest. But when you have a communication network that makes money through advertising, through monetizing attention and data, it is a fundamentally destructive business model, and that is the problem.
And so the business model is flawed. We've heard arguments in favor of changing it, what you're saying on Capitol Hill with Zuckerberg, and these arguments have gone nowhere. What you're advocating, Matt, is treating social media platforms like a utility, right? But that's going to take regulation, and it just there doesn't seem to be any will in the U.S. for any regulation at the moment.
Yeah, I think that whether Congress will pass laws or not, I mean, there's definitely a lot of discussion about it, but I think the fundamental problem here is there is regulation. Right now, that regulation is Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, which says that Twitter or Facebook or any of these platforms, any website, has no liability for anything that its users do on top of those platforms, even if the platforms are trying to encourage them to engage in certain types of behavior. And I think that's a form of regulation, is it's just a destructive form of regulation. So I think if you got rid of that and you said, you know what, you are kind of liable for what happens on your platform, that these platforms will change their business models very quickly and they will stop imposing, offloading costs onto the rest of society that they should be internalizing themselves.
And do you think, Matt, too, if this were to happen, we would also see a change in the nature of content that is on social media? And I'm wondering, would we see a more civil behavior online than what we see right now?
I think you would. I mean, right now you have a whole series of kind of torts and common law prescriptions, things like intentional infliction of emotional distress, or defamation. There's all sorts of things that people can do, and while they might be liable for them individually, when that gets amplified by a million times by YouTube or Facebook or Instagram or whoever, the underlying platform isn't liable for it, and not only are they not liable for it, they can actually sell advertising against that. So on January 6th, we're organizing the riots on Facebook. Facebook was actually selling ads against that content, and that is crazy to be profiting from that kind of incendiary and in some cases illegal content. And if you actually make the law apply to these platforms so that there's a public process for actually addressing the harms that are caused by these by this bad content, by this illegal content, then I think you're going to see a much better way of kind of sustaining society, honestly.
Yeah. And if Elon Musk becomes the owner of Twitter, he's going to go in the completely opposite direction. He is an absolutist when it comes to free speech. He's going to say no regulation, no restrictions whatsoever. The business model is going to be even maximized compared to what it is right now. That's a disaster scenario, in your opinion, isn't it?
I mean, he can't really do that. It's if people on Twitter, as they did, years ago, are recruiting for terrorists or they're moving, child pornography, there are going to be prohibitions there. There are going to be spam filters, right? Twitter is, these are networks and they inherently structure speech, which means they impose limits. So the idea that Elon Musk is going to come in here and just sort of be a free speech absolutist doesn't actually make any sense, because these are networks, and networks are organized around limits to what people can do, as well as that's how you set what people can do. Is you say this is what you can't do, and within that zone of sort of freedom, people can do whatever they want. But he might change that. He might expand what people can do in some areas and reduce it in other areas. But the point here is that these are not decisions that any individual, whether it's the current Twitter management or Facebook management or any of these dominant platforms with their management are thinking, or whether it's Elon Musk, these should be public decisions made by public governments that have democratic legitimacy.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people around the world who would agree with you, Matt, and they would say that it's high time for this to be put into some form of action. Matt Stoll, the Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
These are the huge wheat fields of Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula. For the people of Yemen, however, this is no bountiful harvest. Much of Yemen's population depends on foreign food aid, and a lot of that comes from Ukraine, one of the world's biggest wheat exporters. But the war in Ukraine has already disrupted exports, making food shipments headed for Yemen more expensive by the day. The political situation in Yemen is also volatile. Earlier this month, the warring parties launched their weapons in the first nationwide truce since 2016. It came after 7 years of war between the Saudi-led coalition and the Iran-backed Houthi rebels. The conflict left hundreds of thousands dead and millions displaced, but that truce is now hanging by a thread, with each side accusing the other of breaking it. My next next guest tonight is Anel Chilai. She's a Middle East expert at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. It's good to have you on the program. War in Ukraine means smaller wheat harvests, and that means fewer exports, which means higher prices for food aid needed in places like Yemen. Has the world realized with the invasion of Ukraine just how intertwined the world's food supply really is?
I believe so, and this is not the first time something like this has happened, but unfortunately this does come at a particularly dire time, not only for Yemen, but it was a spike in wheat prices that preceded the 2011 Arab Spring, when we saw people overthrowing governments. And so it really is a question of what sort of political volatility may emerge as a result of the high price of wheat. But particularly in Yemen, where the population is so dependent on humanitarian food aid and where prices were already so high as to be out of reach for many individuals, contributing to mass starvation, this really, Yemen was already in such dire straits, and so the fact that now this is happening, it's just really tragic.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that. Yemen was in a disaster situation before the war in Ukraine began, but the attention of the world is now firmly fixed on Ukraine. Is the international community, is it forgetting about the humanitarian crisis that is Yemen?
Unfortunately, Yemen has been forgotten for a long time. I think part of that has to do with the fact that we're not seeing the same kind of refugee flows out of Yemen. So there are millions of internally displaced people within Yemen, but just the geography is such that people are not very easily able to escape or to arrive on the shores of Europe, for example, or other places where then the media would turn its attention there. In addition, as you pointed out, now that there's been such a focus on what is happening in Ukraine, I think you're absolutely right that what little bandwidth there was for Yemen, unfortunately, may have dried up.
And does it also show the double standards in foreign policies, and particularly for richer countries, that there's so much attention and also so much money available to help Ukraine? But when we're talking about helping the people in Yemen, you're constantly feeling like you're a beggar when you're going out onto the international market.
Absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, it's quite heartening to see the response from Europeans to Ukrainian refugees, people welcoming these refugees into their homes, but it has really highlighted the discrepancy there. So not only the treatment of Yemenis, but how Syrian refugees were received at the height of the so-called refugee crisis in 2015 and 2016. And in the case of Yemen, I do worry that there is a certain amount of donor fatigue. We just saw the UN convene its big annual conference to try to raise over $4 billion for humanitarian assistance for Yemen, and they were only able to raise $1.3 billion, and those are just pledges. And so, in the past, sometimes a country may have pledged and not ultimately delivered. And, in the case of Yemen, it's just particularly, I think, part of the difficulty there has to do with the fact that the United States is complicit in what is happening and is profiting from the war that the Saudi-led coalition is waging on Yemen. And so, whereas in the case of Ukraine, you have the US or Europe beginning to feel very righteous about pushing back against Russia and supporting the poor Ukrainians and assisting their underdog fight. In the case of Yemen, the US at least, as well as the UK, are fighting on the side of the aggressors. They're selling weapons, they're providing military support, they're providing intelligence support to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other members of this coalition that are bombarding and blockading Yemen.
And it seems there's not a big world power advocating for the people of Yemen the way we're seeing for the people of Ukraine, is there?
No, so the dynamics in Yemen, Saudi Arabia initially intervened because they feared that Iran was providing assistance to the Houthi rebels. What's ironic is that in the intervening 7 years, that assistance, which had been fairly minimal, has increased. The UN has imposed measures to prevent weapons smuggling, and for the most part, the weapons that the Houthis are using are weapons that they seized from the Yemeni military, in part because they were allied with the previous president early in the conflict and so had access to these weapons. But the point is there's been this narrative that the United States is pushing back against this Iran-backed proxy, when in reality, the scope of what the Houthis are able to do, especially against Saudi Arabia, is tiny compared to what Saudi Arabia and the UAE are doing to Yemen in terms of the scale. There are 400,000 civilians who have died as a result of the war, both kinetic violence and structural factors, so starvation, lack of clean water, disease, lack of medical care. And yet you have the State Department, for example, continuing to reiterate that the U.S. has to help Saudi Arabia defend itself. And Saudi Arabia has experienced a handful of civilian deaths resulting from Houthi projectiles, which are very unfortunate. But again, just the scale is just astonishingly different.
And all the while, you have the everyday citizen in Yemen, living from hand to mouth and possibly facing starvation now. And now we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
They wanted to incite riots and destroy democracy. That is what German police were saying about 4 members of a far-right group who were arrested today on suspicion of plotting violent attacks to sow civil unrest. Prosecutors say that they were planning to blow up power stations and to kidnap Germany's health minister, Karl Lauterbach. Professor Lauterbach has received lots of criticism because of his support for measures to stop the spread of COVID-19.
The plot to bring down democracy was said to have been hatched on Telegram. Prosecutors say far-right extremists wanted to trigger power outages and civil war-like conditions. It didn't stop there. The plan behind this was to kidnap the Federal Minister of Health, Professor Lauterbach, to kill his personal security and accept this as collateral damage. The health minister praised police and said he was unfazed. This will not affect my own work. I'll continue as before. Lauterbach, who has supported tough COVID-19 measures, has been a regular target of protesters. He said the plot showed that such opposition had been co-opted by far-right elements. This is about forces that intend to destabilise the state and democracy as well. They're obviously taking advantage of the COVID-19 protest. It is a small minority in society, but highly dangerous. We have to keep an eye on that. Authorities said the suspects were affiliated with COVID-19 protest groups and the Reichsbürger movement, which denies the existence of the modern German state. The unifying and foremost element of the grouping is hatred against our democracy and its government officials.
Как мне сказал один чувак, когда в Яндексе работал.
In more than 20 nationwide raids, police confiscated firearms, ammunition, cash and gold bars.
Well, the day is almost done. The conversation, it continues online. You'll find us on Twitter, either at DW News. You can follow me on Twitter at BrentGoffTV. And remember, whatever happens between now and then, tomorrow is another day. We'll see you then, everybody.
of normality in the midst of war. The first stores open again in Kyiv. But the war is not over yet. On the outskirts of Kyiv, volunteers continue to prepare for the worst.
Focus on Europe. Next on DW. Is the end of the pandemic in sight? We show what it could look like. A return to a new normal. And revisit those who are finding it difficult. Experiences, successes, and news. In our weekly COVID-19 special. In 60 minutes on DW. It started out with spooky intimidation and transformed into an orgy of hate and violence. The history of the Ku Klux Klan, the oldest terrorist organization in the United States. Its members fight for a racist state ruled by white supremacy.
What we're talking about here is not only disorganized violence, it's not only terrorism, it's politics.
Founded over 150 years ago, it's repeatedly died out, but always been resurrected. The Ku Klux Klan starts May 11th on DW.
This is Focus on Europe. I'm Lara Babalula. Nice to have you with us. Destroyed buildings and mass graves. Cities and lives are in ruins as Russia's war rages on in Ukraine. Places in the east and south of the country are under heavy attack as the war enters a new phase. In the Donbass region, Putin's troops appear to be readying to launch a major offensive. Well, people around the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, in contrast, are cautiously optimistic. Russian troops have seemingly withdrawn from Ukraine's north. Scars from the war are still visible, and fears of further attacks linger. Yet, day by day, a sense of normality is re-emerging in Kyiv amidst the shock and trauma.
Kyiv resident Anna is doing something for herself after weeks of watching her world fall apart. Getting her nails done.
Of course you want to feel clean, look good. That's part of life. There's death everywhere anyway. Now that Kyiv is waking up, I'm realizing that there's hope despite everything. Ukraine is going to win, but it is going to cost resources, time, and of course lives.
Bunny Nails has started welcoming customers again in branches all over the Ukrainian capital. And there's plenty of demand.
When you're at work, you think you've gotten used to everything. But you can't get used to bombing at night. We barely slept last night.
But in certain parts of Kyiv, something akin to everyday life is returning. Stores and cafes are reopening. And for now, there's less risk of a land invasion by the Russian army. However, there is still the danger of air raids. Despite a longing for a return to normality, Kyiv's residents are preparing for the worst. We met Mariana in a wooded area on the outskirts of Kyiv. At 29 years of age, she worked in an office for the city administration before enlisting as a volunteer.
2 days after the invasion, I realized I would go crazy if I didn't do anything. I barely have any experience with weapons, but the way I see it, when your life is at stake, you don't have a choice. I just hope that my hands and brain will do exactly what they have to if it comes to that.
Руки спрацюють, мозок включиться і буде так, як треба.
Mariana and the other women and men with her are all part of the territorial defense, the Ukrainian Army's voluntary units. It was formed in 2014, the year of the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. Today they boast around 130,000 members.
This war can only end with our victory. There can't be any compromises. We can't sit at the same table with terrorists. They're killing our compatriots, our children, parents, sons, daughters.
Some 250 kilometers away in northeastern Ukraine, not far from the Russian border, lies the small town of Trostanets. The Russian composer Tchaikovsky once spent a summer here composing music. The locals here lived under Russian occupation for about 4 weeks. Ukrainian forces drove out the Russian military only days ago. The residents had to survive without water or electricity, and food remained scarce. Supplies are being distributed in front of this church. Svetlana Ruban is also waiting.
We really need this. We all hid at home for a month. I didn't have any potatoes left. The Russian soldiers were in the town center and I avoided it the entire time. I was afraid.
The Russian army shelled the surrounding towns from this central square. Russian soldiers slept in the train station buildings and in stores, some of which they also plundered. The Ukrainian army shelled the Russian positions as it recaptured the city. Most locals refused to talk to us about their experience of the occupation, saying it was too painful, but they all say that their relationship with Russia is destroyed for good.
I've already had a very different relationship with Russia since the Donbass War of 2014. I wouldn't say I hate them, but I despise them. But not all Russians. Like my friend, for example. She cries on the phone with me. She understands and begs me for forgiveness. On the other hand, I've got a lot of relatives in Russia who don't believe me. They say we're to blame. But why? Because we're Ukrainian?
For now, the people of Trostanets are relieved that the Russian occupation is over. But it will be a long time before everyday life returns to normal again.
Well, the war in Ukraine is also affecting food security for the local population. Well, the country is one of the top producers of grain in the world, earning it the title of Europe's breadbasket. And before Russia's invasion, much of Ukraine's wheat was exported to Europe, Asia, and Africa. But that food supply chain has been disrupted, driving up the price of wheat dramatically. Andrei Voitenko works in the agriculture industry. His top priority is to ensure the people of Ukraine have enough to eat, even if it means there will be chronic shortages elsewhere.
The wheat harvest this year should be a good one. It was seeded last winter. Andrei shows us how they worked the soil and removed weeds. But unlike previous years, he's unsure of how to proceed this time. His seed supplier has now changed over to wartime production, which means supplying what Ukraine needs for its own survival.
Just as the fighters are doing their job at the front, we're doing ours in the wheat fields. We realize that the war affects everything, so we're planting more spring wheat. I'm speaking for my own agro-business. We're producing less corn, but more wheat. That's how we're enhancing our food security.
At the President's request, Ukrainian farmers are planting less corn, sunflowers and canola, and more grains. The military asks us not to show where Andrei's farm lies, because an army base is located nearby. We're only allowed to show the hogs outside. Inside, you can also see the snails Andrei exports to Spain and France. There are bags of seed grain too. It's labor-intensive work.
We have 22 full-time employees and about 150 seasonal workers for the 2 or 3 months of the production period. And then I need someone to crossbreed the plants. That's a specific job, and I have to hire someone to do it.
In the center of Zhuvka, we meet the mayor, Oleg Volsky, equipped with a pistol and showing off videos of target practice with a Kalashnikov. Suddenly, the war seems a lot closer. Inside, he shows us remnants of a Russian missile that struck here a few days before. He's worried that neighboring Belarus could enter the war. But right now, he's got to win the battle for the next harvest.
Most of the men have volunteered to go off to war. Many of them were also drafted. The only ones left behind are the men over 60 years old. Now we're looking for them to drive the tractors and work other machines. We have a big problem with our labor force.
Alongside Russia, Ukraine is Africa and Asia's breadbasket. Ukrainian farmers were previously exporting over 4 million tons of grain per month. Now the government puts the figure at just a few 100,000. With the Black Sea ports effectively blocked, wheat, corn and cooking oil can no longer be shipped. Soon agricultural production itself may start dropping. The shockwaves are felt around the world. Grocery prices are rising. The UN fears that hunger will spread, especially in poorer countries. An agricultural expert from Lviv offers little hope.
If the situation continues the way it is now, we won't have any problem with food production in Ukraine. If Ukraine produces 100 million tons of grain, and half of that is exported, the harvest could turn out bad 2 times in a row, and we still wouldn't starve.
Even so, that would mean fewer exports to the world, especially to countries that depend on Ukraine's surpluses. Andrei and Ukraine are likely to find ways to deliver their products through the EU by land, but the question will soon be how much they'll have left to export at all.
Ukraine's Donbass region isn't the only place where separatists receive support from the Kremlin. Putin's regime also backs Serbian separatists in Bosnia-Herzegovina, while the region of Republika Srpska wants to become independent, sparking fears of another conflict in the ethnically divided country. 30 years ago, war crimes were committed in Bijeljina, Bosnia-Herzegovina. It was the catalyst for the Bosnian War. Yusuf Terbic survived the bloodshed back then. Now he fears that the separatist movement could lead to a renewed conflict.
They are marching once again. Bosnian Serb nationalists displaying their colours earlier this year. This parade to mark the anniversary of the proclamation of the Bosnian Serb Republic, Republika Srpska, is officially forbidden. But the strongman of the Bosnian Serbs, Milorad Dodik, doesn't care. He wants secession from Bosnia, and for the Republic to have its own army. Some people in Bosnia-Herzegovina fear another war. The last war in Bosnia, a slaughter, was just 30 years ago.
My knees were shaking. We heard gunshots, explosions. But we thought it was a war between soldiers, gunmen shooting at each other. But these were civilians, elderly people lying there in the street. Only then did I realize that this was something completely different.
Yusuf Terbic saw it all. The war began in Bijeljina with a war crime against this wall. At least 48 men, women and children were murdered in town. This picture of a fighter kicking the dead bodies became a symbol of the Bosnian War. Terbic was the only male prisoner to survive the Bijeljina massacre. That's why the former journalist decided to stay there, as a witness to the truth, which he shares over and over again. War criminals are still popular in Republika Srpska. The former Bosnian Serb general, Mladic, is a hero in this graffiti, and it's not an isolated case. Turbich cannot understand the nationalist parades.
What they are celebrating here was the source of unspeakable suffering and indescribable crimes, the persecution of hundreds of thousands of people and the killing of thousands. It led to mass graves and concentration camps comparable to the model set by the Nazis.
If you ask the people in Bielina, you get a mixed response. Many, however, subscribe to the nationalist slogans of their leaders and see their future in that of Republika Srpska in a place outside of Bosnia.
I see no way out, neither in Republika Srpska nor in the Bosnian Federation. The governments are corrupt everywhere.
It's better to be a part of Bosnia, but independent in every other way, like with the flag and so on. Everything we already have. I'm for independence, with our own money, our own flag, and our own army. Otherwise, we're under pressure from the Bosnian Federation and Sarajevo.
Christian Schmidt is in Bosnia on behalf of the United Nations. As the so-called High Representative, he is supposed to de-escalate tensions between the ethnic groups. He is extremely concerned about the general nationalist mood, and also the fear shared by Bosnians.
I don't see any danger of war. But I do see how tension could build up as a result of targeted actions, or a combination of circumstances, which could erupt into violence.
For Yusuf Turbich, violence has been a part of everyday life. As a journalist, he couldn't get a job in Bielina for 10 years, finally opening up a cafe instead.
I had to do something, and of course I ran into a lot of problems, provocations. Once, they completely destroyed my bar, and another time they tried to set it on fire.
На самом деле так и
I put up with everything,
Как ты свою
because I think
жизнь
that all
живешь,
the
больше
problems I
никого нету,
face
кроме
are
тебя.
the price I have to pay for doing what I do.
Как ты живешь свою жизнь, это единственное, все больше ничего нет.
Yusuf Turbich has written
Ну,
several
не так,
books about
я
what
говорю,
happened then and what is happening now.
Ты, я, ну никаких,
Irritating
какие
a
мы,
lot of
нет
people
никаких
along
мы,
the
есть
way.
ты, один
He
человек.
also testified before the International War Crimes
Мы это
Tribunal.
специально, чтобы на кого-то
His
скинуть
latest
можно
book
было,
focuses
то,
on
что ты...
nationalism among Bosnian
Да,
Muslims.
ну он понял.
It is banned in Republika
Специально, чтобы
Srpska.
утешаться можно было об этом, понимаешь? Есть женское понимание «мы».
Belgium is home to many
Ну, как
distinctive
бы даже
regions,
женщина
and
так
we're
тоже.
taking you to one of them
Женщина
in the
все равно она,
country's east.
все равно ты.
It's a
Всё равно
community
женщина.
with a population of around
Но они более
80,000.
как бы социальные.
Here, German
И в
is
то же время
spoken in
одинокие.
schools and courthouses.
И в то же
It's
время
one of
социальные.
Belgium's
Видишь, как
3
все
official
парадоксально.
languages. Eupen
Ну да.
is the capital of the region, and it even has its
Из
own
них,
unique
собственно, выходит,
parliament.
потому что деваться
Their
некуда.
politicians shape policy together with ordinary
Ну, наверное.
citizens. It's an experiment in
Какая
do-it-yourself
разница?
democracy.
Jana
Нет,
Hendricks
это
is
никак
30
не про...
years old
Это
and
не...
a member
Нет,
of
я
the
не про это
Citizens
вообще говорю, это
Council.
ваша проблема просто.
Mathilda Noyens is
Просто
64
женщина, она
years old
более
and chairwoman of the
слабая,
Citizens
поэтому она больше на
Council.
других...
Their
Ну,
story
и она
began
все
2
время
years ago.
беременная.
Jana
При,
was student
при
received
нормальном
an
исходе
unexpected
женской
letter
жизни
from
она
the
все время будет
Citizens Dialogue in
бременем
East
для
Belgium.
всех, понимаешь?
Das Parlament hat sie ausgelost.
Parliament drew my name
Это
at
при
random.
нормальности,
You
представляешь?
can become a member of the
Это
Citizens
при нормальности, то
Assembly.
есть как бы если
Join in
женщина
and meet
нормально всю
24
жизнь
other
проживет.
citizens whose names
Света
were
говорит,
drawn.
все остальное что-то как бы...
What did I think at
что-то...
that moment? I thought, oh God, I can't do this.
Очень просто можно сказать, ты бы не захотела так же
But Jana
жить,
took
как ты
on the
живешь сейчас.
responsibility. Since then, she's been commuting regularly
Ну,
from her college town
хотеть на это,
Aachen to the
значит,
Citizens
меньше. Надо
Council
больше, чтобы тебя
sessions in
хотели, чем
Eupen,
чтобы ты
which she
хотела.
is now
Или
co-governing.
чтобы хотели за тебя, или чтобы тебе
Okay,
указывали,
I
что
have to be
надо
present and
делать.
participate. I can also vote on issues
Наверное,
that may be
как-то
of
так.
interest to me or to the young people here, so count me in. The parliament of around 80,000 German-speaking Belgians called
Не
upon
важно,
the
это
newly
все
elected
какая
councilwomen
разница.
to help improve
Так что,
nursing care in East
если есть
Belgium.
реальность, то что сравнивать,
The
это
region
сложно.
has a say in many things.
У вас
The
тоже по
knowledge
одной
and
жизни, всех по одной
experience of
жизни, да.
citizens here in Eupen have served a
Ну,
purpose
что-то
since
древнее,
2019.
да.
Wenn man die Geschehnisse in der
When
Ukraine
you watch the events going on now in
как-то, ну
Ukraine,
почему?
you know democracy can't be taken for granted.
Ну,
I
это не
think
назидание,
only
это
if we
просто
all
математика.
stay on the ball will democracy have a chance of surviving long-term in our world.
in unserer Welt.
These two women are part of the Citizens Council, which meets outside the regular sessions of Parliament. It's still an experiment for now, but will soon become a permanent institution. Career politician Antonios Antoniadis is a Parliament minister. At first, he was skeptical about making policy with ordinary citizens,
Ну, я
or
вообще-то опять
amateurs.
слушайте,
People have certain expectations, and one of those expectations
Просто это же,
is that
ну
everything
да.
has to happen right away and fast. And eventually it will happen because we're here. And if it doesn't, it's only because somebody doesn't want it to.
But the citizen
Польза
council
миру,
members
вот
are
это тоже
prepared.
разговор.
They
Так,
can
польза миру
consult
приносить.
experts,
Откуда
collect
ты?
information, and discuss ideas with one another and the politicians.
Правильно. Естественно,
Even
надо
the
всех
career
убивать, чтобы пользу
politician learned a thing or
приносить.
two.
Ну не те, которые вот там, а с
Dialogue
другой стороны только.
We suddenly realize that there are many things we cannot take for granted, and that we have to start communicating differently with one another.
Да, он понял тебя уже.
This
Я тебе
time,
точно
the chief
сказал.
annoyance will be speaking to Parliament. The greatest cultural achievement of a nation is contingency years. She's fought for her ideas for 2 years, including greater self-determination for seniors and for their family members in retirement homes.
Das ist jetzt gesetzlich verankert.
Now, by law, every senior care facility must create a council for relatives.
Ладно, ничего не важно. Ты делаешь, живой же пока еще.
This is one way the Citizens Council women hope to make life better for everyone in the Eupen region. It was a long, hard road through the planning and coordination processes, but they were determined to see it through. It takes perseverance. I mean, not just for myself, but in general, because you see that these processes can take quite a long time. The day turned out very well for the chairwoman. Of 5 recommendations made by her group, 2 were passed. I'm satisfied, relieved, and a little proud. Yes, I'm happy. Both intend to carry on in East Belgium Citizens Council to keep practicing real democracy. Well, a recent study by Statista shows that less than half of the world's population live in a democracy. One of those people is Sabriya Navrozi, a professional athlete from Afghanistan. She was forced to flee her country where the Taliban have stamped out democracy and imposed a dictatorship. With women's rights eroded, Sabriya feared for her life. The Islamists labeled her an infidel because she plays soccer. So she and her entire team fled to the birthplace of the beautiful game. In Leeds, England, they are living out their dream on and off the field.
Sabriya Norozi can play soccer again at last. In Afghanistan, she was captain of the junior team, but they were all forced to flee. She's been living in northern England now for several months.
When play football, I think I'm very happy, but I don't have any problem in the life.
This is no longer possible in her home country. She's too well known there. She co-founded the first women's soccer team in Herat in western Afghanistan, a sport forbidden to women.
I think I'm sleeping. Now I'm so happy because all the meal I'm paying, I can go to football. I can give work.
When the Taliban came back to power, Sabriya Norozi was forced into hiding. She didn't leave her home for 10 days. The Taliban considered soccer players like her to be infidels, and she risked her life to escape. She was scared to death when she handed her papers over to the Taliban at the border.
He treated me horribly. He opened the gate, took my bag, and pushed me towards the direction I should walk in, and said, "Go, and don't come back, because if you do, our government will kill all of you."
Sabriya Norozi struggled before the Taliban came back to power. She was even beaten up. But she'd persevered enough to enjoy success and participated in international tournaments, drawing even more negative attention.
They tried to kidnap me twice. Once they tried to stab me in the back. But someone helped me. So only the tip of the knife hit my side, cutting my lower abdomen.
Soccer player Khalida Popal knows what Sabriya and her team have been through. She helped them and their families escape, procuring British visas for a total of 130 people. A visit to the Soccer Museum in Manchester, where they learn how English women too had to fight for their rights.
I mean, going through the history from English women's football and their ban and the history of like how the FA banned it, it's very much like it's 100 years ago, and it's very similar. Like hearing that and also seeing the object, it's very similar to our story, like today's story. The women of Afghanistan is banned for playing football just because they are women.
Khalida Popal is one of the pioneers of Afghan soccer, a role model for young female players.
And we started playing football for the first time in the history of Afghanistan back in 2007, where we used our platform as a movement to stand for our right as a woman of Afghanistan, to change the history, but also make history and say we are half of the population, and you cannot just decide for us on behalf of us.
These successes are now in ruins. Sabriya talks on the phone with her mother-in-law in Afghanistan. She tells Sabriya that women today are receiving threats just for going to the market on their own. The terror catches up with Sabriya in England too. She has nightmares about the Taliban trying to kill her. Her team and her love of the sport help her to cope with it all.
I like football because all the girls be together. But together is passing, shooting, and it's very amazing for me. But when they get a goal, I'm very so happy. But oh, goal, I like it, the goal. Emotions. Yes, emotion.
Sabriya has already introduced herself to Leeds United. She's hoping for a professional career. Because soccer to her means one thing above all, and that's freedom.
It's more than just a game. That's all from us this week at Focus on Europe. Don't forget you can watch more of our show online at dw.com. Bye for now.
Жить нормально. Война это точно не нормальная жизнь. Да. А, нет, ну нормально, да. Ну нет, значит не война, да. Понятно. Вот это он имеет, да, я понял вас. Жить как будешь жить для себя. Правильно. Надо служить тем, кто что-то, ну, важно. Да, ну, это себе так говоришь. Ну, отдыхайте, да. Ну, понимаешь,
Is the end of the pandemic in sight? We show what it could look like.
Короче, что-то да. У всех по одной жизни, и все только и думают, как свою жизнь пожить одну единственную. Так всегда было. Все остальное Все остального просто нету. Что это?
Weekly COVID-19 special. In 30 minutes on DW.
The Holy Sepulchre of Jesus Christ in Jerusalem. An eternal point of contention. Daily arguments, insults, beatings. The never-ending conflict over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
75 minutes on DW. We've got some hot tips for your bucket list. Romantic corner, check. Hotspot for foodies, check. And some great cultural memorials to boot. DW Travel, off we go. What does war do to people? Are hatred and violence inherited from generation to generation? An award-winning documentary.
Тратишь деньги, тратишь себя, понимаешь? Не имеешь права. Расточительность. Покупаешь вещи, которые не используешь. Тратишь свою жизнь напрасно. Или те, которые тебе не нужны на самом деле. Или те, которых ты не знаешь, как использовать. Ну, смотри, нет, если я играю на аккорде 3 гитары, но это моя профессия, да, я, например, не знаю, Найк Борзов или еще кто-нибудь. Да не важно, ну как бы не супер какой-нибудь там Зинчук, но вот играю с этой гитарой, да, и получаю, ну, играю на гитаре и получаю эти профессии, если меня так достал! И мне казалось бы, зачем мне инструмент, который стоит там, не знаю, 20 тысяч долларов, там, например, да? А оказывается, надо. Мне нужен звук, потому что, да, то есть я его покупаю, ну, это осознанно просто, на самом деле. То есть, ну, по сути так. Да не важно даже, когда, то есть, вроде как, потому что тебе не нужен такой крутой инструмент, зачем ты его покупаешь? Но потому что в этом крутом инструменте есть очень крутой звук. Внутри, во-первых, позвольте это мне больше денег заработать и быть лучшим, как сказать, в своем деле трехаккордной игры, которую я делал. Да не важно это.
Russia says the incident happened as the vessel was being towed back to port in a storm. Ukraine says its missiles took out
Короче,
the
может быть и
ship.
такое, что казалось бы тебе, вещь какая-то, но это вещь актив. Это вещь, которую ты используешь для заработка денег в делах. Но что таксиге нужен Бентли, это я очень сомневаюсь, понимаешь? Что если вот таксист, мне нужно вот не обычный автомобиль человеческий, а какой-нибудь навороченный, да, и я залезу. Во-первых, это он сам поплатит, сам себе ну, да. Не будешь работать как, ну, понимаешь, я еще раз говорю, у всех по одной жизни. Да, то есть тут выше, да. Нет, ты же не автомобилист, зачем тебе это? Да, деньги-то у тебя просто за таксы из ВОЗа, ну или что там, доставку за курьера, все. Чистенький, нормальный, Лада, девятка какая-нибудь, все. И все, что-то блин. Да. 100 тысяч стоит, и обслуживание будет стоить тебе 1000 рублей в месяц, понимаешь? И то лучше, а может и как-то, ну не знаю тогда. Ну, например, сколько там, ну 500, не знаю. Нет, это все просто трюк такой, что ты покупаешь автомобиль немецкий, который... Ты запчасти на него купи хотя бы один раз, тогда посмотри. И масло, и заплати за него, налоги там и так далее. И что там не хватит. Подоходный на роскошь. Ну, наверное, да. Но это уже называется взвешенность. Смотри, если я куплю Ладу говешку и буду ее за 100 рублей, например, куплю, и буду на нее 1000, ну, сколько-то тратить, 3 рубля тратить в месяц на ее обслуживание. Или я куплю получше за 200 тысяч, буду за 200 тысяч, да, и буду 2000 тратить в месяц. Или за 300 тысяч буду 1000 тратить в месяц. А где-то этот баланс заканчивается, начинается уже, когда ты... А потом уже 400 тысяч, и будешь уже 1500 тратить, понимаешь? И уже плюс налоги, а там за 500 это уже будет 2000, еще плюс налоги. И так далее, и содержание, и так далее. Ну, так вот всегда, вот я говорю. А кто, ну, понял,
Its loss marks a significant reduction in Russia's firepower in the area and a huge symbolic blow
for Moscow.
Ну да, короче, по нужности, по количеству.
DW's Russia analyst Konstantin Eger explains just how significant the loss of that warship is for Russia.
It is stunning indeed. I served 3 years in the Soviet Army and nothing of that could have been imagined then. Well, it is a blow to prestige, definitely. It is a very practical blow to the Black Sea Fleet too. Our colleague mentioned 16 cruise missiles. I spoke to Navy experts today, all through the day, and they told me that around about 70 cruise missiles were before in the arsenals of the Black Sea Fleet. That means basically like more than 20% are off now. And finally, it is important that Moskva, which was actually ironically called Slava or Glory in Russian, in the Soviet days, it was commissioned in 1983, was supposed to be the main air defense platform for the whole Black Sea Fleet. It was armed with, well, fairly advanced air defense missiles that they failed to intercept.
То есть есть некий автомобиль, покупаешь когда, да, то есть автомобиль покупаешь когда он является твоим активом, на что ты зарабатываешь. Вот как для компьютерщика компьютер, да, то есть, смотри, если я программист, имеет мне смысл брать Macintosh за $5000 или нет? Большой вопрос. Ты сколько зарабатываешь с программированием? То есть, может быть да, может быть нет. Сколько у тебя об этом данных? Ну, к примеру, я тебе говорю. По-разному может быть, потому что если ты где-нибудь, не знаю, там, на радиозаводе где-нибудь, в сенсях программируешь что-то там, дольный станок на калькуляторе какой-нибудь, то как бы тебе не нужен, наверное, Macintosh тратиться, хотя ты можешь его в кредит гипотетически взять за 100-500. Да. А если ты в Москве программист, тоже много вопросов. Надо тебе это или нет? Зависит от твоей от того, сколько зарабатываешь ты денег! Уровень какой у тебя квалификации? Квалификации! Уровень у тебя как у программиста какой! Ну, понятно, что головой все равно придется думать. Я просто объясняю принцип. И конкретно, да, понятно, ну видишь, как неудобно, надо думать головой все время, ты же не знаешь. Нечем думаешь, да, я мне ем скажу.
17-year-old girl was allegedly raped. For weeks, the family had to hide in this small basement room, always fearing that they could be the next target. It's hard to imagine a place with more destruction and with more human suffering than here in Makariv. The town of Bucha has become a worldwide symbol of Russia's war crimes, but it becomes more and more apparent that there are many more Buchas all across Ukraine. Igor worked as a teacher in Makariv before the war started. Now he walks through the town distributing donated medicine. Often he only finds empty rooms. 90% of Makariv's residents have left or been killed. Igor's friends used to live in this
Можно со всей Украины снести трупов, вот какая-нибудь там смертоубийственная, ненавистная Россия, вот деревню так, или переименовать деревню просто какую-нибудь. Ненавистная Россия. И туда вот снести трупы в разных позах, разложить их. И ждать, когда все съедут, что там со спутника сфотографировать, все, можно затушевать еще что-нибудь там. И это, ну, к примеру, я тебе говорю. И потом можно в каждом интервью везде можно, столько можно бабок заработать. Вообще просто.
Russian soldiers shot one of his neighbors on the street. They asked, "What are you digging here?" He said, "It's a grave for my dog."
Ну, вы уподобились своим врагам, наверное.
It's also your grave now, and they just shot him. 3 weeks ago, Makariv was liberated by the Ukrainian army. Since then, many volunteers have come to help with the cleanup work. But the gruesome memories of the survivors will probably stay with them forever.
So many butchers all around.
World news headlines. Chinese social media users have posted images of Shanghai police in hazmat suits grabbing screaming residents from their apartments. Weibo users say authorities have taken over several residential buildings to quarantine COVID-19 patients. Frustration has been mounting in Shanghai, where millions of households have been in lockdown since the end of March. Israeli security forces killed 3 Palestinians
Вот это и
in the
получается,
occupied
что
West
роскошь.
Bank on Thursday.
Понимаешь?
Israel has
Если я
launched
какой-нибудь, не знаю, из малых мозгов программирую там, я сижу в мозге, что-нибудь программирую, и купил себе Macintosh. Но опять же, смотри, ты сейчас можешь в мозге как бы сотрудничать с Microsoft, например, да? Ну, гипотетически так, там можно, смотри, чем удобство, действительно, ведь можно целый снять там, не то что, да, можно огромное, ну, понял меня, да. Тогда, может быть, если у тебя оборот большой, вот я про это тебе и говорю, это зависит от квалификации, как бы, да. Нет, все равно головной офис будет в Москве у тебя, а то и вообще где-нибудь там, в Нью-Йорке, еще черт его знает где. Ну не черт его знает, а в Нью-Йорке, и там, где придумали слово «le programme», там, где откуда все профессии, ну не профессии, может быть, даже все, дела все откуда приходят, где придумают что-то делать всегда, да, облегчать, когда, где придумали калькулятор, компьютеры, где придумали колесо, и огонь придумали разводить тоже, наверное, и так далее, да. Где кору головного мозга придумали, где и так далее. Где не спять, да. Где более проявлены мужские качества человеческого. Ну, просто давайте так оставим, да. То есть это явно не Россия, если честно. Если у вас какие-то претензии. Ну, это конечно. Это вообще при чем здесь? Ну, то есть страны мира, которые не по фэншую живут, но по фэншую скатились на западное полушарие. Ну, северо-западное, скажем. Не знаю, как это получилось. Ну, нет, они, конечно, идеальные, они вообще. Ну, нет, не касается. Такие же, как все, наверное. Ну, получше, наверное. По-своему, да. Ну, флагманы, понимаешь, передовые просто. Флагманы, лидеры, да, то есть на них все смотрят, с них все берут примеры, всегда брали и будут брать. И прямо сейчас берут, и потом будут брать, понимаешь. Ну, у тебя, значит, глаз нет, если ты этого не понимаешь. Смотри, войны, вот с кого Россия брала пример, когда был Петр I, например, и когда он завоевывал турецкие крепости, и когда со шведами, так сказать, легкая крепость, да, это самое вооружение, понимал, да, ну турецкие крепости, это просто так. А турки с кого пример брали? Ну, не с зулусов же, понимаешь? Ну, когда они воевали с всей Европой, турки с кого пример взяли? И так далее. То есть, ну, все, точка, вообще не о чем говорить. То есть, даже вот в этих, да, не о чем говорить. Нет, я тебе не про войну говорю, я тебе про жизнь говорю. То есть, про обычную жизнь нормальную, да, бытовую. Потому что все, что в бытовой жизни есть, оно все европейское. Все, ну, да, и у турок тоже, к сожалению. И так и будет дальше. Ну, не знаю почему, то ли у всех остальных, кроме Европы, стран Запада мозги атрофированы, то ли черт его знает, непонятно. То есть они просто колонизаторы, они все взяли, все стащили, и ни правового двигателя, ни братьев Люмьер, ничего этого, они просто подняли свою экономику. Блин, ты чё, целая Индия, ты смотри, какая Россия, тут не то что экономика, тут да, то есть кого ты смешишь? Понимаешь, обезьяне любые очки выдай, вот вообще, еще очки с каким-нибудь, еще чем-нибудь, она все равно обезьяной как была, так и осталась, понимаешь? Никакие очки обезьяну не изменят ни к чему. То есть дело не в экономике поэтому, не важно какую ты дашь империю, какой-нибудь говенной, какой-нибудь безмозглой какой-нибудь стране, какие гигантские территории, она все равно как была говенная, так и говенной осталась. Ну это слепое подражание просто, да. Не знаю, ля психушка, да. Я Я знаю все ваши теории, бля, я не тупой же, я просто наоборот сам. Это же не наш до всех хуесосов.
Down on militants following a wave of deadly attacks on its citizens. 14 Israelis have been killed in the past 3 weeks. The US federal court has convicted a former member of the so-called Islamic State for his role in a hostage-taking plot. El Shafi El Sheikh, a former British national, was charged with abduction, torture, and the beheading of several IS hostages in Syria, including journalists and aid workers. He's the highest-profile IS fighter to stand trial in the US. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says tens of thousands of asylum seekers could be sent to Rwanda to be resettled. Johnson says the agreement would tackle illegal immigration and that migrants would be humanely removed to Rwanda. But the opposition Labour Party calls it unworkable and unethical. South Africa continues to battle the consequences of one of the biggest natural disasters in the country's history. Devastating floods triggered by 2 days of intense rainfall earlier this week have killed more than 340 people in the region surrounding the port city of Durban. Our correspondent Adrian Krish has more.
From up they look like toys, but they are heavy shipping containers moved away by floods. Sachin Harisunka's company stored 1,500 containers at this depot. They are now trying to recover them.
What added to this atrocity is the looting. They raided the offices, they stole computers, they basically cut all the cables from these reefers, fridges, microwaves, spares, whatever was there, whatever they could salvage, they basically took. It's hard, so all our hard work, but it is what it is. We just have to rebuild from here.
But the first question for the team is, where do you even start?
You can see this massive destruction and the force of nature right here. The economic consequences of these natural disasters, they are very visible now, but they are likely going to be troubling this region for a long time.
The destruction is visible in many parts of Durban. Thousands lost their houses, and help hasn't reached everyone. Our houses are destroyed. Some of us don't have jobs and no money, so we don't even know where we will sleep tonight. We have lost food, grocery, everything, even our clothes and property. We don't know what we're going to do. So many people have died here. We're pleading for assistance. We don't want empty promises.
I feel so very, very, very bad because I have got no place to sleep. I'm standing like this, but I can't sleep. So I can't do nothing. My two children, my other children are with my other neighbors because we have got no place to sleep.
Rescue operations by helicopters are underway, as some places are still not accessible by road. The death toll is likely to continue rising.
The first 2 days we were all going for the rescues and just trying to make a difference and getting people out. The last 2 days and I think a couple of days to come, it's just body recoveries. So we've all got that urge in us and that hope that we still find a few people alive, but it's just mostly body recoveries.
Back at the container depot, Sachin Harisunka and his team are still busy removing containers from the nearby highway, so at least the traffic can flow again. Things won't get back to normal anytime soon, the South African says, but at least, fortunately, his company was insured.
Here in Germany, police have arrested 4 members of a far-right group on suspicion of plotting violent attacks to sow civil unrest. Prosecutors say the suspects were planning to blow up power stations and to kidnap Germany's health minister, Karl Lauterbach. Professor Lauterbach has received heavy criticism because of his support for measures to stop the spread of COVID-19.
The plot to bring down democracy was said to have been hatched on Telegram. Prosecutors say far-right extremists wanted to trigger power outages and civil war-like conditions. It didn't stop there. The plan behind this was to kidnap the Federal Minister of Health, Professor Lauterbach, to kill his personal security and accept this as collateral damage. The Health Minister praised police and said he was unfazed. This will not affect my own work. I'll continue as before. Lauterbach, who has supported tough COVID-19 measures, has been a regular target of protesters. He said the plot showed that such opposition had been co-opted by far-right elements. This is about forces that intend to destabilise the state and democracy as well. They're obviously taking advantage of the COVID-19 protest. It is a small minority in society, but highly dangerous. We have to keep an eye on that. Authorities said the suspects were affiliated with COVID-19 protest groups and the Reichsbürger movement, which denies the existence of the modern German state. The unifying and foremost element of the grouping is hatred against our democracy and its government officials. In more than 20 nationwide raids, police confiscated firearms, ammunition, cash and gold bars.
You're watching DW News. Here's a reminder of our main story. Russia's defense ministry says its main warship in the Black Sea, the Moskva, has sunk while being towed back to port in stormy weather. Hours earlier, Ukraine said its missiles hit the ship, causing an explosion and fire. All 500 crew aboard the vessel were evacuated. You're up to date. After the break, business news with Rob Watson. Remember, you can go to our website for more news. It's dw.com. I'm Toby Oladipo for myself and the team. Many thanks for your company.
Guardians of Truth. Exiled Turkish journalist Can Dündar.
I have paid almost every price of being a journalist in a country like Turkey.
And Mexican investigative journalist Ana Hernandez.
People are dying every day. The government is involved.
She's been digging the country's soil to find out the truth.
They want to kill me, and they tried many times.
Facing a gun can change your life.
People need to know what is happening there.
Guardians of Truth starts May 3rd on DW.
Elon Musk moves to take control of
Лишаться,
Twitter.
видишь,
The SpaceX
лишаться
and
бремени
Tesla.
это по-мужски. То есть я думаю головой, изобретаю рычаг, мне надо меньше мускулатуры. Я думаю головой, изобретаю калькулятор, мне надо меньше усилий, чтобы считать. Изобретаю компьютер, изобретаю интернет. Да, то есть я не то что даже лентяй, просто я мужчина. Я люблю быть свободным, я не люблю свое время ну, типа того. Ну, или там, ну, да неважно даже. Ну, хорошо, даже, или в тяжком труде вынужденное поколение, может и так тоже. Даже не суть. Ну, так. Ну, пусть даже так будет. Ну, наверное. Ну, не совсем, наверное, что-то. Ну, другая крайняя сторона, что тебе только когда конкуренты, когда только прижмет что-нибудь. Или когда женишься, выгодно, да. что может женщина лучше сделать, чем тебе рожать детей постоянно. То есть все, больше ничего не бывает. Все остальное искусственно, скажем. Все остальное просто нездоровое. А если нездоровое, то следовательно говорят. Что-то да. Вопросы есть еще? Жди добра тогда, да? Судьбе единственной своей жизни. Ну, лучше она у тебя пройдет. Мужские. Ну, что ты был самый. То есть никто бы никогда не изобрел никаких приспособлений, ни интернет, ни компьютер. Но он о себе так думает. Да. Ну, нет, это сказки просто. То есть ты серьезно, что ли, ты хочешь сказать, что я знаю про это, ну то есть, что благодаря интернету только, да, ну он это имеет в виду. Ну, вот это он имел в виду. Ну так. То есть изобретать на Западе привыкли. Да? То есть, не знаю, это не важно. Важно, что так. Это все остальное, может, да, досужие, да, все точка. То есть все приходит с Запада. Вот это он имеет в виду. Мне это не интересно, мне это не касается. Ну так и говори, я женщина, вот и все, а ты не женщина, понимаешь? Вот и все. Значит, тебе надо приходить, значит, тебе надо идти на Запад, правильно? И чтобы оттуда приходилось все, что твои плоды. Ну я надеюсь, это имеет в виду. Ну нет, да, нет. Мужчинам, я понимаете, это он имеет в виду. Нет, я он понял тебя, вот это он имеет в виду, да, понятно. Ну, не то, что надо, а само по себе так получается. Ну, да. Ну, могло бы получиться, если бы ты был более человека. И я в том числе, да. Еще не все потеряно будет. Да, если мне все равно, кроме как гаешкой, кроме каким, ну да.
the founder, has offered to buy the platform outright and
to shave off a few cents per tank is another.
Other things in life have to get sacrificed, you know, that means smaller meals or shorter trips. Maybe we even have to skip like a vacation.
It takes right now about $200 to fill up my car. It's not going to look good.
Enter California's Governor Gavin Newsom. The governor wants to hand out debit cards worth $400 to every Californian owning a car. The price tag for that idea, 11 billion California tax surplus dollars. This, however, is only a temporary, not a solution, experts say. In fact, it seems almost certain that high gasoline prices are here to stay, or worse, that they will increase.
Now to look at some of the other global business stories making the news. President Xi Jinping has emphasized that China must stick to its strict zero-COVID policy, ending speculation that current pandemic measures could be relaxed. Large cities, including financial hub Shanghai, are under a strict lockdown, with a growing impact on the world's second-largest economy. And the International Monetary Fund plans to raise at least $45 billion for a new trust to help low-income and vulnerable middle-income countries amid challenges like pandemics and climate change. IMF head Kristalina Georgieva says the goal of the trust is to redistribute funds from wealthier to more vulnerable countries as members look to support global economic recoveries. Now, the European Central Bank kept its key interest rates unchanged on Thursday. The ECB faces a dilemma with Eurozone inflation hitting a record high of 7.5% in March. Fuel and food prices are surging and supply chains remain snarled up. But the US has taken a different path to the ECB, raising
До свидос.